Welcome to How to Space a Font. I'm Thomas Phinney. These days I'm president of FontLab, but I'm also a type designer, and once upon a time I was even a beginning type designer, actually for a long time. So I remember painfully how hard it was to learn how to space a font, and it took me actually a long time to not suck at this. So during that long period when I did suck, I gradually learned stuff, and hopefully I can help you guys with some of that. So all this will be available as a video later on YouTube, which means that although you're welcome to take notes, and you're more than welcome especially to ask questions, especially at the end, that means that you don't have to worry about making screenshots or whatever, because you'll be able to refer to it later. So let's talk about how to space fonts. We're going to define a couple of things. So spacing is a matter of setting side bearings to equalize the apparent white space between and inside glyphs. Equalize might be too strong a word. We'll talk about that more in a bit. It relates the space between glyphs to the space inside glyphs. Even looking spacing is dependent on the design. A font that has smaller counters, that is smaller internal white space, needs less space between the letters. The other big variable is what is the intention of the font. A font designed for text sizes needs more space. A font intended for screen use at text sizes needs even more space. And the one main thing to know is that beginners usually space too tightly. There's a reason for that, by the way. If you're a beginner and you're spacing, you are spacing letters really big on screen. So you end up spacing what looks right for large sizes, what I'd call display sizes, rather than for moderate to small sizes. So you're spacing it so it looks right really big on your screen, and then when it ends up in text, it ends up a lot tighter than that. So a couple of terms that I've already started using. Side bearings, the left and right side bearing, are the amount of space between the space reserved for the glyph. The entire space reserved for the glyph, by the way, is the advance width. The side bearings are the amount of space between the space the glyph is in and the edge of the sort of inked part of the glyph. So the left side bearing is the distance to the first leftmost point on the glyph, and the right side bearing is the distance from the other edge to the rightmost side on the glyph. Generally, these are both expressed as positive numbers, the amount of white space in between. However, you can have glyphs even that extend past the advance width on either the left or the right. So for instance, if this was a lowercase f, it is possible that the right side bearing might actually be negative instead of positive. And then I have all these definitions written up, which I will just leave here for posterity. You can look at them later on the video. So in general, for most typefaces, you start by spacing the lowercase, and the two letters you start with are N and O. And you first adjust the N and adjust its side bearings, then do the same with the O, and then look how they look both in isolation and in between each other. Then you go on to the cap H and the O. Obviously, if you have an all caps font, you jump straight to those two. And these are referred to as control characters. Later on, you're going to be comparing, once you've got these really dialed in, you're going to be comparing the spacing of other letters to these ones. In some cases, you're going to be able to just borrow the values you used on these ones. If you've got a letter with a straight edge, it's a cap, you can just borrow the side bearings from the cap H. Similarly, if you've got a round letter, your left side, your sides of your O might be the same as the left side of letters like cap C, cap G, and so on. So you're establishing a baseline here. And in terms of spacing the white and not the black, and also in terms of spacing depending on the amount of white space inside letters, you'll notice here we're looking at myriad. And you'll notice here's myriad regular, and the space in between the ends is maybe maybe half the space inside the letter. But you'll notice that that space gets smaller in the more condensed and bigger in the more extended versions. So even though the outside edges of the letter, their shapes didn't change too much. Well, okay, they did with the O's a bit. But the important thing here is that the internal shapes, because there was more space, you get more space between the letters as well, or at least that's what the designers did. Of course, I like Myriad because A, it has a range of weights and widths, and you can see a bunch of things going on, and B, it was designed by people who are really, really quite good at this, Robert Slimbach and Carol Twombly. So when we look at the bold condensed ends, you'll notice that the white space between the letters has gotten the smallest, and it's actually pretty close to the space inside at this point. In the bolder weights, the difference is less. In the lighter weights, there is some difference, but at the same time, the space between has opened up. By that, so what I'm saying here is that in the boldest weight at the bottom, by the way, can you guys see my mouse pointer? I'm assuming you can. If you can't, I will be talking differently. Yes, good. Thank you. I assumed so, and it suddenly occurred to me that if you couldn't, that would be bad. I think I discovered that was a problem in Keynote, and it's one of the reasons I'm using PDF instead of Keynote now. So let's move on. Now, it's interesting that there is actually kind of a dominant method of spacing. There's just really one main one. I mean, yes, we'll talk about how you do it by eye and so on, but you still need to start somewhere. And even this thing of having key letters is itself part of the method. So the dominant method is one designed by this guy named Walter Tracy. It's described in his book Letters of Credit, A View of Type Design. Now, sadly, if I recall correctly, I think Letters of Credit is out of print at the moment, and has been for a while. If you do find it, it's a fine book. Walter Tracy was head of design for Linotype back in the day. And it's a fine book, and the other similar book, by the way, that I put in sort of the same category is Anatomy of a Typeface. They both spend a lot of time describing a few typefaces in great detail. However, because Tracy's method is so popular, it's also been reproduced and repeated in a couple of other books. Karen Cheng's Designing Type, which is reasonably affordable, and Fontographer Type by Design by Stephen Moy. Now, two things about that book. Yes, it has Fontographer in the title, and in fact uses examples from Fontographer, but a lot of the info in that book about type design is sort of universal, regardless of what app you use. The Fontographer book is out of print, but used copies have been super cheap. They were as much as $300 before Karen Cheng's book came out, and then that killed the secondhand market for the other book, which is funny because they cover very different ground. If you're starting out in type design, those are both fine books to get. So here's a simplified version of Tracy's spacing method. So you start with lowercase n. Assuming it's a sans, you'd put about 2/3 of the space inside the counter of the n on the side bearings, which would mean 1/3 on each side bearing. Maybe a smidge less. Depends. Space between O's, you do about 5/8 of the end side bearing. Now that's in a sans serif. In a serif, you just do it till it looks right, or looks roughly equivalent. Now note that how big you make the space on the O's depends on the shape of the O a little bit. So I said 5/8. That's sort of for an average O. If your O is really round, it might be a tiny bit more than that. But if it's a really condensed or squarish O, let's say it's an O from Eurostyle or even just Helvetica, it's going to be more because the squarer shape puts sort of more of the letter off on the side. And then you tweak it. And you tweak it until the apparent space between the O's seems to look pretty much the same as between the N's. And then you start reusing these things. So the left side of the N, the right side, by the way, is going to be a smidge less, like 3 to 8% less, typically, depending on the shape a bit. So that would typically be, if you've got 1,000 unit M square, that would be about 2 to 8 units, maybe. The N straight side gets used for a whole bunch of other letters. The O sides can also be used for other curved shapes. In some typefaces, some of these might be slightly less round than the O, like BDPQ. The round parts might be a little less round than the O, and so they might get a smidge more space. Sharp angled letters are, the diagonal letters are a bit more contentious what to do for them. Some people even will give them negative side bearings where the pointy bits are sticking out. For instance, with a cap A. I tend to do 0. Nice, easy number, 0, easy to remember. Other people might go as high as 10 or even 15 out of 1,000. I find that a little more than I would generally do myself. So this applies to the pointy bits of these letters, K, V, W, X, Y. Now Z, the lowercase z, the cap Z, the cap L, and the cap T, we're going to talk about them a little more later. They have slightly more sticking out to the side because of instead of a diagonal coming in there, it's a straight line with a solid edge. And their spacing also can depend on weight. Now, there's a few other letters that we haven't dealt with. You notice that there's a few letters that don't fall evenly into any of these categories. S, oh man, I hate spacing the S. It's evil. I'm not in the work of Satan level of evil, but it's troublesome. I like drawing S's, hate spacing them. Now, the other interesting thing is, so you did your N and O, and you move on to the caps. Remember we talked about cap H and O. Caps usually get just a tad more space than lowercase, like 4 to 10%. Depends on typeface, depends on the X height, depends on the designer's preferences, all sorts of things. Now, here's my updated. This is sort of my updated version of Tracy's stuff, which is I've tweaked to better handle sans as well as serif. You can compare it against his original, if you like. So here's a whole chart, and again, I would say just look at the video. Don't try to copy this down. So first, space your N's and O's visually, and then you can use this as guidance. And the asterisks are, well, just make it visual. In some cases, for instance, lowercase a, depending on the design, at least the right side bearing will have some relationship to other stuff. Same with lowercase g, perhaps. Some of these things, like lowercase s and t, and God help us, lowercase f, are troublesome. For lowercase f in particular, I'll comment that if you have a high top arch of the f, or sorry, a long top arch that overhangs quite a bit, I, for one, am just fine making that have a negative side bearing so that the bottom part spaces well against X height letters. Of course, if you do that, you have to be accepting that either it's going to collide with letters like B and H, letters with ascenders, and also if immediately followed by a cap, or you might need ligatures for some of these or something, or maybe you need to add kerning pairs for them later. But in general, I'm in favor of making the bottom part of the F space correctly and letting the top arc do what is necessary. So caps, spacing your H and O, you could start out with doing them about 4 to 10% more than N and O. And similarly, they have their own guidance. There are slightly fewer squirrely letters in the caps. I'll point out something here. So when we talk about spacing the Q, for instance, spacing the right side of the Q the same as the left, which is the same as the O, that assumes that the tail doesn't stick out further. if this tail were sticking out more, your program would treat that as part of the outline. For spacing purposes, if the tail is below the baseline, you can ignore it, right? Or because you're going to assume that there's no letter with a descender right after it. However, that means also, and we'll show you this in a minute, at least the FontLab way of dealing with this, that you have to go out of your way to ignore that, and you don't accidentally just set the side bearing the same and end up with a honkin' big gap in here. That also has implications for how you might think about designing the tail of the queue. If it is sticking out above the baseline, that's going to create spacing issues. So there are interactions between spacing and design. So I had a question. Why should cap I, lowercase l, lower I be asymmetric? Actually, they should all be symmetric. And that's a basic principle here that I've kind of skated over, but we'll go back to it in a moment. If you've got a letter with a symmetric shape, it should have symmetric side bearings. There's several reasons for this. One is if someone centers the text, you want the centering to be truly centered. Another is that in justified text, again, having equal side bearings is a good thing. A third reason is that's how other typefaces are designed, and therefore, if your typeface is going to mix with other typefaces, you really need to have optically centered your letters in their side bearings. So we've looked at the lowercase, we've looked at the caps. What about the space character? Okay, well, this is tricky. As a starting point, you could try using 1/4 of the M. You know, if you've just got a few letters, you're just getting going, you want to have a space just because you need to be able to hit spacebar and put space between things, and you don't want to have to use kerning in your app to do it. So you could try 1/4 of an M. So if you've got 1,000 unit M square, 250 units. That is about average. Might be a smidge more than that. Once you have an I spaced, you could try making the space the exact same width as the I, and then tweak it if needed. Now here's an interesting little thing. I was mentioning that the cap T and L sometimes present some issues for us. And the reason for that is that the amount of ink at the edge varies depending on the weight of the letter. So if you've got a thin T, the thickness of this little vertical line here on the left side is very thin. There's not much ink there, not much more than there would be with a V. But if you've got a really bold T, all of a sudden there's a substantial amount of ink there. And this could be even more, at which point it needs more space. So you get an interesting thing. In general, as letters get bolder, their side bearings go down. But the one exception would be the cap T and L, whereas they get bolder, typically their side bearings actually would increase. Now in this case, with shapes that do not have, there isn't anything getting thicker at the edge in the same sense, letters like this, there's no more ink at the exact edge of the contour, and so there's no direct need to increase the spacing. Instead, what's happening, as mentioned earlier, is the counters are getting smaller, and so the spacing gets tighter. This N has a fraction of the white space of this one, and so the spacing in the bold is tighter. Excuse me. Okay, I am going to switch and give you a bit of a demo. 1 second, water break. And I am keeping a vague eye on the comments in the chat window, by the way. And so if you have a question or you think I might have missed something, feel free to ask. I may just get back to it later. The other thing is someone mentioned Leslie Cabarga's book on FontLab, and yes, that is another fine starting book. It is as much how to use FontLab Studio as it is how to do stuff and an intro to type design. But it is a good a good quick start. If you know a bit about type design but you've never used FontLab Studio and you're getting in, then his book Learn FontLab Fast is a fine choice. So I have here a typeface. This is Adobe Source Sans. It's an open source typeface, and I'm going to open up our friend the metrics window, and you'll notice that it currently has 0 side bearings. Ah, how'd that happen? Someone went through and munged this font. The jerk. Wait a minute, it might have been me. Okay, so let us look at a metrics window here and start doing some spacing. So I'm just going to space this font right now, very quickly, a little crudely, live, and we'll go from there. And let's get a couple of N's and a few O's and a few NO combos. No is the classic thing. That's not bad. And knowing that the O is typically about 5/8, I might just do that. Okay. Now the question is this good? My next thing, remember how I mentioned people tend to space stuff too tight because they're spacing at large sizes? So I'm going to make it smaller and look at it some more, and I don't know. And this is the point where I remember, right, the right side of the N needs to be a little less than the left side. It's a nice thing about working with Cyrillic is they have some lowercase letters that are truly symmetrical with straight sides. So And while I could, in real life, if I was doing this for real, I'd be, doing this at different sizes, previewing it, maybe do some printouts. But for now, I'm just going to pretend that I got it good enough. And let's just check. I'm just going to check the measurement. I'm curious. I might make that a tad more. I'm feeling just a little. So 225 is the measurement, and the right side bearing is, of course, 85. So 85 on both sides, 85, 167. That's 167 over 225 is about 3/4. So yeah, it's probably good. Maybe it's even a little loose. Who knows? I'm going to leave it. I like it well enough. I'm thinking Source Sans is supposed to be versatile, and I intend to use it at text sizes. Remember, I'm pretending I'm the original designer here. And I'm intending to use it at text sizes as well as bigger, and so I want to space it so it works well at text sizes. So I'm going to leave it at this level, which is loose, but seems about right. And now, so having done the N and the O, we can immediately start doing some other letters. Left side of the B is also going to be 85. I've seen a few people who actually make the the letters with ascenders, big straight ascenders, have a little more white space than letters like the N. I think because they're worried about them going up against other letters with ascenders, like say an L, and making sure they have enough space. I don't do that myself. There are differences of opinion. Now here's one of those things where you have to decide how much space to put on the other side, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But first I'm just going to type in these other things. If you're on a Mac, note that I'm using version 5.1.5 of FontLab Studio. And yes, I'm using the numeric keypad and tab and cursor keys because I can just whip through this stuff if I do it that way. However, there was a bug in 5.1.4 that meant that if you did this, you couldn't go back to editing. So I do recommend 5.1.5 for this purpose. Now I'm looking at this and saying the round bowls of BDPQ are actually a little more flattened than the O. Not much. I'm going to give them a few more units. This is a level of detail that you probably don't need to worry about starting out, but I don't mind letting you know that it exists. And here's a tricky one. The L has this little foot. Do you space it for the foot or do you space it for the rest of the letter? Now, if I just type in a number right now, you'll notice that, of course, the measurement is actually from this point. Now, FontLab has an extra cool thing called the measurement line. Use the measurement line. The measurement line is this red line here. You can adjust it, and what it does is it says, measure the side bearing to where the measurement line crosses the letter and ignore everything else. This can be handy if, for instance, you're trying to think, well, the L there, I definitely don't have enough space because even with the measurement line in play, it's less than the other side. So it needs to be at least that much. And I think that'll give enough space on the foot. I'm going to leave this alone and ignore the foot for spacing. Not everybody would make that choice, just so you know. Some people would instead give the foot a little more space. If this was a bolder weight, I might find myself forced to make a different decision on that. So let's say this was, a black weight and the foot of that L was 2-3 times as thick. I might say, yeah, I can't ignore that anymore. And I might start upping, making the side bearing take into account the foot more. So, we can quickly go through. Better turn off that measurement line again for the moment. I'm going to space the right side of this kind of A the same as the N because they're pretty similar. And the left side, well, that's one of those tricky optical questions. I'm going to throw in a number and hang on. Sorry about the cough. One moment. Okay, so so I know I need to come back to the A. The F is pretty tricky. So I'm going to, obviously I don't want it to be 0. I'm going to start by giving that about 15 on that side, and I'm going to go ahead and make this negative. And I'm going to bring in the measurement line. 81, well, obviously needs to be at least as much as the left side of the N, which would be 85 from that point. And I'm going to make it a smidge more to take into account some allowance for that top bar. On the right side, though, it's pretty big. I'm going to make it smaller. Oops. But let's see what that is. Well, it's negative 41 there. Negative 41 to the top. Bring that up to there. I think I want this to be bare minimum 10 units or so to that crossbar. G is a tricky one. You'll notice that some of the widest points in the G are actually in its descender. You could conceivably ignore those, but also there's a lot of ink on the left side of this G that's close to the edge, and less so on the right side. So what I really ought to do now, though, I'm going to... You're going, what? What are you doing? Hang on. I'm spacing between the standards. So I'm looking at the spacing of these other letters and seeing how the spacing of my new letters looks by comparison. In general, it's not bad. A is okay. I could maybe make that a tad smaller. G is fine on the left, but on the right, there's a lot of white space in there. So I'm going to reduce that. And the other thing I should be doing, of course, is comparing these against O's as well as A's. I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, you know what? The right side of the N could actually be a smidge smaller, and also the right side of the A as well. Anyway, fine-tuning. And so this is essentially the process of spacing. Some of it is just repeating shapes across letters, and saying, okay, I can just copy those shapes, those numbers. And some of it is optical and just doing it by eye. And we're going to really quickly whip through. Here's a fun question that often comes up. How much right side bearing to give to the R, the lowercase r? And it's tricky, and generally it's going to be very small. In this case, the edge is slightly diagonal, so I'm going to go close to, but not quite at 0. S and T need to be done between the standards. Nothing else is going to get you even close to the right answer. U can look a lot like N. So if N is 85 and 80, the U will be 80 and 85. We already talked about my personal preference for making some of these diagonal letters typically 0. The Z, though, has some straight edges up against the outside, so I'm going to give it a little more space. K, left side will be the same as the N. Right side, I'm going to leave it 0. H, I'm going to do the same as an N. I and J, I'm going to turn on the measurement line. The reason being, I want a space relative to the stem. Typically that dot will stick out a little. In fact, you can tell the difference here is about 15 units. And I want to space it relative to the stem and have consistent spacing with some of the other letters. And the same with the J. And you'll notice I'm totally ignoring that descender on the J. It sticks out. If I turn off the measurement line, you'll see the actual left side bearing is negative 38. And oops, I haven't done M yet. I think there's something looking odd about this string of text. And now it's just S and T left. Boop, boop, boop. So 0 isn't enough. Yeah, I hate spacing the S. I like drawing them. I used to hate drawing them too, but now I like drawing them and I still hate spacing them. And I'm waffling. I could agonize over this for a long time. Now, for whatever reason, Am I crazy? Yes, I am crazy. And yes, one could spend a long time on this, but that's good enough. So that's S, and now T is an interesting case. T has some similarities to our friend F because it's got a crossbar and all, and usually that crossbar is longer on the right than the left. And the funny thing, as with the F, it doesn't necessarily need a lot of space. So the F has a 26 left side bearing. The T has a similar shape, crossbar sticking out about the same, has a little more white space there. So because this is cut out, I'm going to make it a smidge less. I'm going to just make it 21. On this side, I'm going to do not much at all. Oh, the other thing you sometimes need to check is how the letters interact with, more extreme letters. So I just added a couple of things, but just for base spacing, yeah, it'll do. Alrighty, so I think I have just spaced, yep, the entire lowercase of source sans. And let's type some text. Or at least show some text. Now that's awfully big. I'm going to make this a lot smaller. Yeah, it's okay. It's not the best spacing I've ever done, but then I did it in about 20 minutes, so that's to be expected. Is the S maybe a little tight? Yeah, maybe. Can I even see what I just did? Not too much. But it's a start. Oh, I didn't space the space character. But I left it at its original. Okay, well, here's an interesting question. So space is 202, and my I is 252. I'll bet I have spaced this looser than the original. Let's do a quick look. We're going to just open. Oops, I can't even spell. I'm going to open the real font. And we're going to look at the spacing. I've done this before, by the way. And the first time I did this, I came out really close. And holy crap. Okay, let's see. Oh, I must have the wrong. Hang on a sec. I must have the wrong thing. For a moment, it was pardon my language. It was looking like the I had gotten the spacing the same, and that seemed unlikely. There we go. So it is pretty darn close. So I had 85 for my left straight side bearing, and in the actual font it's 82. Okay, I can live with that. That's pretty awesome. And what's interesting is they did a bigger difference between the left and the right of the H and N. So I did 85 and 80, and they did 82 and 73. My rounds are a little more generous at 54 instead of 46, but that's roughly proportional to my difference in the uprights. So that means that, yeah, in 20 minutes I spaced the lowercase pretty similarly to the actual thing that people agonized over for a long time. Not the same, and probably not as good, but for a quick 20 minutes that wasn't too bad. For people who are joining us late, yes, there's a recording, and it will be posted on YouTube within a week, probably just a couple of days, probably later this week. So hang in there, and you'll eventually catch up. So that is a quick summary of the whole spacing process in general. I'm not even going to bother doing the caps. We've talked about the differences. It's really the same thing over again. I do want to make a note on serifs, though. So spacing serif fonts is harder. I know people who do not find it harder. I'm not one of them. So the effect of serifs on spacing depends on their length and thickness and so on. Normally you don't completely ignore them, but you also don't treat them as if they were a main stroke because they're not as thick. And also you're kind of looking at the rhythm of the main stems. Generally in a serif face, you're not going to have, if the serifs are long, then you're going to need to increase the spacing a bit between the main stems just to make sure the serifs don't run into each other. Again, you're going to make the base spacing look right with strings like this, and spacing the N's and spacing the O's. If the serifs vary in length, you may be have more dependency on using that measurement line feature and ignoring the serifs for the purposes of once you've established how much space you want between the stems. In other places, you may want to just ignore the serifs if their length is varying and space based on the stems, just as long as you can do that without having excessive collisions. I'm not going to be talking about kerning today. Kerning is a separate thing. Get the base spacing right first, and I will add, this is one of my standard type design spiels, and I will often basically say the same thing for 5 minutes straight, which is basically space first, kern later. Wait until the entire typeface is completely done before kerning. I really wait as long as possible and then wait more. The reason for that is that if you start kerning and you change your spacing, you're going to have to throw out some or potentially all of your kerning. And that's really painful. Kerning is very time consuming, much worse than spacing overall, typically. And so you want to be absolutely, absolutely certain your spacing is done. I am like probably the only type designer I know who has ever said, yeah, I probably waited too long to start kerning. However, more times than that, I have started kerning too early and thrown it away. Everybody kerns too early. Even if they know this rule, they'll still do it. Partly because you just see combinations that bug you and you're tempted to do something about it. Fine, do one or two things, but really, try to reel yourself in. I do start spacing as soon as I start drawing myself. I'm drawing in a font editor, and so I've got access to the spacing. The side bearings are right there. Might as well make them right. There are still plenty of apps, by the way, that do not kern by default. Microsoft Word, Microsoft Office apps do not have kerning on by default. Most browsers do not have kerning on by default, at least at text sizes. So it's another reason to get the spacing right. You don't use kerning to fix errors in spacing. You use kerning to deal with exceptions. So that said, let's move on and talk about italics for a minute. So italics present a couple of extra complications for spacing. So here's the basic thing. Let's say that you're doing a really simple italic font and you start by skewing your upright font. Let's say it's a sans serif, and so it really is more or less the same design. You're going to start by skewing and then make some adjustments. So here's a problem that you're going to run into. As soon as you skew the upright text, on the left side, you've created more space. You just slanted that S away from the left side bearing and over top of the right side bearing, right? So you created more space here and reduced the space there. Now what that means is if you were to simplistically view the italic as just a slanted version of the regular, and of course even if you're doing a simple sans serif, after you slant it, you should fix the outlines, because some of these, especially this S, oh man, that looks awful. But that aside, you also need to adjust the spacing. And basically, what you need to do is shove all the letters back to the left a certain amount. And the interesting question is, how much? Right? So we've skewed it. Obviously, we've made the right side not fit. We've added space on the left. And the reason you need to do this is that italics, A, they can be centered, for instance, so you want them to actually center correctly. And B, italics commonly get used in the middle of regular text, and you want your word spaces to not evaporate, just at least not have the right-hand word space evaporate because you italicized. So, yeah, because this is a honking huge space, and that's not really enough anymore. It barely looks like a space at all. So what do? Well, it turns out that math is your friend. Those of us who did not enjoy our high school math classes may want to debate this, but really there is a formula you can use. So the question is basically, I slanted it, and then I need to figure out how much to shift it. And this gets in, basically, we're looking at a triangle. The slant angle, we know the slant angle, we know the height of the letters, and we're trying to figure out how much they shifted. Now, obviously, we don't want to shift back the whole amount. We want to do half of it to center within the shift, right? So the height that we're going to center on, and we don't want to shift it. Yeah, I'm sorry. The height we're going to center on then is based on what? The cap height or the X height or something else. Now, Walter Tracy suggested that you would do the shift relative to the cap height, and here I actually disagree, I think for good reasons. Personally, I find that most stuff that gets italicized most of the time is mixed case or lowercase text, not all caps, and I actually would take the average of the cap height and the X height. So, questions, comments, anything else I could show you quickly? So, one person said that they just want a consistent level of gray across the line in the sense of the average brightness and nothing too dark or too bright, and he just squints and quickly glances across the line. And yeah, that's a kind of technique a lot of people actually do use when looking at spacing. Squinting, backing way up from the screen. Like, I'll leave this stuff moderately big on screen and I'll back up as far as I can. And, oh, there's a good question. Is there a way to quickly paste the same spacing amounts to a bunch of fonts? And let me show you something. And the answer is yes, either within a font or across glyphs. So I could, for instance, do this. Hit copy here. This is the version I spaced, and take another font and do edit. Now this should work. I haven't actually tried this. Edit paste special, and oops, I just copied the caps, which I hadn't actually spaced yet. So that's not going to do anything very useful. But what if I do the lowercase, which I did actually space? Edit copy. Go to the other window. Now, will the edit paste special? Now, this was another font that had the spacing completely wiped out. Okay, so there was like negative side bearings. I expect this is going to look really loose. This has a very low X height. So yeah, there's a couple of issues, but yes, I did successfully paste literally the side bearings from the one font into the other font. So there you go. So yes, in this case, it's copying letter to letter. And it's just saying, okay, you had this range of letters in the first set and that range in the second set. So they need to be the same letters in the same order for that to work. Now the other thing that one could do is, you can scale these things too. So I just want to point out, I'm going to take an action and metrics, and I can do things like I can say, you know what, this was a little loose for this other font. I'm going to decrease the side bearings by 15 on both sides. Bang. And pull up the metrics window again. Oh, that's looking okay. It's looking a little tight on some of these letters, like V, W, X, Y, Z, but for most of them, I actually have a start on spacing. So Lorraine asks, well, I also want to know is once you define the O spacing, can you pick a bunch of letters in that font to copy your choices? And yeah, you could. I could, for instance, copy the O and then say, I'm going to paste the left side bearing onto B and Q. B and P. Did I say left? I should have done right. My bad. Right side bearing onto B and P, and then the left side bearing onto a bunch of other letters. Most of the time, I find that it's faster for me to just bring up that spacing table, in the metrics window. Go through here and just, have all these letters and just go through and quickly enter the numbers and do it that way. Other people may have a different experience with that. Will there ever be a spacing assistance feature similar to the kerning assistance feature? I think it's fair to assume yes. It'll be interesting to see how good it gets. I think you'll always need to understand spacing, and it will be helpful to have a good grasp of this stuff to be able to see when the spacing has gone awry. And thinking of wrapping up the questions fairly soon here. Anything else? Well, thank you all for coming. And feel free to ask other questions, say on our FontLab user forums. Happy to answer questions in the future. I also do a lot of answers on Quora, but for more type design specific stuff, I'd rather do it where type designers will see. The Type Drawers website is also a good place for asking your type design questions. And I hope this was useful, and look for the video posting within the next week or so, probably this week. Bye for now.